My brother said it like it was nothing. Like he was talking about selling a piece of furniture he was tired of looking at. We were sitting at dinner, my mother's dining room table, the one that seats 12, but only ever seats the people who have spent their whole lives deciding who matters. And he leaned back in his chair, looked at his wife Claudia, and said the words that would eventually end his relationship with the court system and with his own daughter forever. "I'd sell that kid for $50,000 if I could." That's a direct quote. I am not dramatizing, I am not compressing. Those were his exact words. My niece Lily was 9 years old. She was in the next room, and she didn't cry. She didn't run in and ask what he meant. She did something that, when I think about it now, still makes my chest ache with the specific kind of love you feel for a child who has already learned that the world is not safe. She picked up her old tablet, the one I'd given her 18 months earlier when I upgraded mine, and she pressed record. She set it on the bookshelf between two picture frames, and she walked back to the couch and she sat down and she kept watching her cartoon like nothing had happened. 3 days later, I sat in a family court hearing. I did not yell. I did not accuse. I placed a small Bluetooth speaker on the table in front of the judge, looked my brother in the eye, and pressed play. He was banned from custody, completely, that day. But to understand how we got to that moment, how a 9-year-old girl recording her own father on a tablet became the piece of evidence that changed both of our lives, you have to understand who my brother is, who I am, and what this family has looked like for the last 34 years. My name is Nora Scott. My brother's name is Derek Ackhaffer. Our mother remarried when I was 4 years old and Derek was 7, and the man she married, a reserved, financially careful accountant named Edmund Ackhaffer, gave us his last name and his house and a version of stability that looked like security from the outside and felt like a performance from the inside. Edmund was not a cruel man. He was an absent one. And in that absence, Derek learned to fill space. Derek learned that if you spoke loudly enough and with enough certainty, people would assume you were right. Derek married Claudia Ferreira when he was 26. Claudia is the kind of woman who laughs at the right moments and agrees with whoever she is standing next to. I don't say that cruelly. I think Claudia genuinely didn't know she was doing it. It was just the water she swam in. Her family had taught her that keeping the peace was the same thing as being good, and so she kept it over and over at whatever cost it required, including, eventually, at the cost of her own daughter. Lily was born when Derek was 28. I was 25 and completely unprepared for how hard I would fall in love with that child. From the day she arrived, Lily was sharp in the way that makes adults uncomfortable, the kind of child who asks follow-up questions, who notices when the story doesn't add up, who remembers what you said 3 weeks ago and holds it up to the light the next time you contradict yourself. Derek found it charming when she was a toddler. By the time she was 7, he found it inconvenient. By the time she was 9, I think he found it threatening, in the way that small, insecure men find anyone threatening who they cannot fully control. I never had children of my own. That's not a tragedy, it's just a fact. What it meant was that Lily became the child of my life in a way that I didn't entirely plan for and completely surrendered to. I was her aunt by blood and her person by choice. She called me Nora, not Aunt Nora, from the time she was 5 because she said Aunt Nora was too many syllables and she had things to say. Derek and I had never been close. He was 3 years older and our entire childhood had been a negotiation about whose needs took precedence. He won mostly because he was louder and because our mother had a deep belief, never stated directly but always present, that boys required more managing. I was expected to be self-sufficient. So I became self-sufficient. Thoroughly, quietly, deliberately self-sufficient in ways that Derek never noticed and my mother never quite believed. I graduated from law school when I was 27. I did not tell my family until I had already accepted a position with a family law firm in the city. The reason I didn't tell them was not dramatic. It was practical. The year I was finishing my degree, Derek had just bought a house, and my mother spent most of every family dinner talking about his mortgage and how impressive it was that he was building equity so young. I had $212,000 in law school debt, a studio apartment with a broken radiator, and enough pride that I didn't want to compete with his down payment for table space. So I just didn't mention it. What I did instead was study the kind of law that mattered to me. Family law. Not because it paid the best, it doesn't, but because I had spent my entire life watching families make decisions that hurt their children and then explaining those decisions as love. I wanted to understand how the law saw those decisions, what it protected and what it ignored and where the gaps were. I became good at it. Genuinely good, not just competent. By the time Lily was 4 years old, I had my own practice. Small, deliberately small, because I was careful about overhead and because I wanted to stay close to the cases rather than manage the people who managed them. I worked with families in crisis. I worked with children who had no one in their corner. I worked with mothers who had been told, in so many ways, that what happened to them didn't count. My family knew I was a lawyer. They did not know what kind. They did not ask, mostly because Derek had decided years earlier that law wasn't as impressive as business. Derek owned a mid-size landscaping company that had done well during the construction boom, and my mother had a gift for mirroring whatever Derek decided was important. The first time Derek made a comment that registered as a warning rather than just an annoyance was at Lily's 5th birthday party. It was a Sunday afternoon, held in Derek and Claudia's backyard. Lily had asked for a butterfly theme, and the whole yard was draped in those paper streamers that look like wings. She was running around in a yellow dress, completely unself-conscious, talking to every single adult like they were interesting and worth her time. Derek was on the deck with a beer, watching her, and he turned to his friend, a man named Carlo who worked in real estate development, and said, loud enough for me to hear from the folding chair 2 feet away, "She better be worth something when she grows up. I am already calculating how much she is going to cost me in college alone." He laughed. Carlo laughed. I set my cup down on the grass very slowly and looked at the back of my brother's head. I didn't say anything. I picked up my cup, I walked inside, and I called my attorney, a family law colleague of mine named Diane Castillo, and left her a message that said, "When you have a minute, I want to talk through something about documentation and how early is too early." It wasn't a formal consultation. It was a conversation between 2 professionals who knew what patterns looked like. Diane called me back the next morning and we talked for 40 minutes. The thing about working in family law is that you understand, before most people do, that the moments that matter in a custody dispute are almost never the dramatic ones. They are the patterns, the throwaway comments made in front of witnesses, the financial decisions that reveal what a parent values, the way a person talks about their child when they don't think the child is listening. I started paying closer attention after that birthday party, not because I had a plan yet. Just because I had enough professional experience to know that a man who talks about his daughter in terms of cost and resale value at her 5th birthday party is a man who is telling you something true about himself. The second incident that clarified things for me happened the following spring. Lily had started at a small private school, one that had a gifted program, which her teacher had recommended after Lily tested well above her grade level in reading and mathematical reasoning. The tuition was not negligible. Derek had complained about it at least twice in my presence, in the same casual way that he complained about all expenses he considered optional. When I asked him once why he didn't move her to the public school if the tuition was a burden, he looked at me with an expression that was hard to read. "It looks good," he said. "Having her there, people ask what school she goes to." He picked up his fork. "I just don't love what it costs." Lily was sitting directly across the table from him. She was 6 years old. She was pretending to be very interested in her pasta. I looked at her and she looked at me and she gave me the smallest possible nod, barely a movement, just an acknowledgement, and went back to her pasta. She already knew, at 6 years old, how to absorb information and file it away without letting it land on her face. That broke my heart a little, but it also told me she was going to be okay. She had already figured out one of the most important survival skills. You can feel something completely without showing it to the person who caused it. What Derek didn't know, because he had never asked and I had never offered, was that I had spoken with the school's financial director 2 weeks after Lily enrolled. I had set up a secondary account, running quietly through my practice's operating fund, that covered a supplemental contribution to Lily's tuition. It didn't eliminate what Derek paid. It just ensured that if he ever decided the optics weren't worth the cost, Lily's place in that program would not depend on his calculation. The school director, a meticulous woman named Hana Fujimoto, kept it entirely confidential. Lily never knew, Derek absolutely never knew, that was the first institutional move. Small, quiet, designed not to be discovered. The third incident was at Christmas, the year Lily turned 8. My mother had one of her formal dinners. the kind with the good china and the extra leaf in the table, and the requirement that everyone dress nicely and pretend we were a different kind of family than we actually were. Derek came in from a difficult year. His landscaping company had lost 2 major contracts when a larger firm moved into the area, and he had spent most of the autumn being terse and irritable in the way that people who blame external circumstances for internal failings tend to be. At dinner, when the conversation turned to finances, it always did in my family, because money was the language my stepfather had taught them to speak. Derek made a comment about how tight things were going to be for the next 18 months. My mother made sympathetic noises. Then Derek looked at me and said, "You are lucky you do not have kids. The cost of it is something nobody tells you about up front." I had closed 2 significant cases that quarter. One of them involved a settlement that had taken me 18 months to build, and the outcome had been, by any professional measure, exceptional. I did not mention any of this. What I said was, "I imagine it is a lot." And then I asked my mother if she wanted me to clear the plates. After dinner, while everyone was in the living room, I stepped into the hallway and sent a text to my financial advisor, a man named Brendan Osai, who I had worked with for 6 years, that said, "Increase the monthly contribution to the education account by $500. Let's talk in January about restructuring." Brendan responded within 20 minutes, because that is the kind of advisor he is, with a thumbs up and a note that he would have updated projections ready for our first meeting of the new year. By the time that Christmas dinner happened, the account I had established for Lily's future education had been growing for 3 years. It was a 529 plan, opened in Lily's name with me as the account custodian, because Derek had never gotten around to opening one himself despite Lily's teacher recommending it during a parent conference that I had attended, sitting quietly in the corner while Derek nodded at the right moments and then forgot everything the teacher had said by the time they reached the parking lot. The balance at that point was $61,000. I was the only one who knew it existed. This is the part of the story where I need to say something clearly. I was not doing any of this to punish Derek. I was doing it because I had spent 6 years watching how he saw his daughter, and the picture that had assembled itself was not one I could ignore. It was the picture of a man who kept score, who valued his child in relation to what she cost him and what she might eventually return, who spoke about her when he thought no one important was listening, in terms that were not the terms a parent uses about someone they are raising with love. I am a family law attorney. I know what that picture tends to become. I started working with Diane Castillo more formally in the early months of the year before the dinner that changed everything. Not because anything specific had happened yet, but because I wanted to understand the legal architecture of what I was seeing and what options would exist if things escalated. Diane is one of the best family law attorneys in the state. She has the kind of reputation that is built not on aggressive tactics, but on thorough preparation, the sort of lawyer who wins not because she is the loudest in the room, but because she has already anticipated every argument on the other side and prepared for each one individually. Our first formal consultation was on a Thursday in late February. I sat in her office, a clean, spare space with one window that looked out onto the street, and I laid out everything I had been observing for the past several years. The birthday party comment, the Christmas dinner, the way Derek talked about Lily's school in terms of appearance rather than education, the way Lily had learned, at 6 years old, to absorb things without letting them show on her face. Diane listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me 2 questions. The first was whether I had any documentation. The second was what outcome I was actually hoping for. I told her I had notes, personal notes, typed and dated, covering every incident I could recall with as much specificity as possible. She told me that was a start and to keep doing it. On the second question, I thought for a moment before answering. What I wanted was for Lily to have someone in her corner who had the legal standing to act on her behalf if it ever became necessary. Not as a weapon, as a protection. Diane explained the concept of third parties standing in custody matters, the conditions under which someone who is not a parent can petition for the right to be heard in custody proceedings. It is a high bar. It requires demonstrating that the child's well-being is at risk and that the existing custodial arrangement is failing to protect that well-being. Documentation matters enormously. Patterns matter. Specific incidents, dated and witnessed, matter. I drove home from that meeting with a legal pad in the passenger seat and a very clear sense of what the next phase of preparation needed to look like. The close calls started about 4 months after my meeting with Diane. The first one happened at a Sunday dinner at my mother's house in June. Lily and I had arrived together. I had picked her up from Derek and Claudia's, which I did most Sunday afternoons as a standing arrangement that nobody had formally agreed to, but everyone had quietly come to rely on. We were in the kitchen helping my mother with the salad when Derek came in and sat at the kitchen counter and started going through his phone. "I was talking to a guy at the club," Derek said, not looking up. "He said there are some good tax structures for legal practices. Apparently the right setup can shelter a lot of income." He looked at me then. "You should look into it." "I have an accountant," I said. "I know, but this guy said most small practices are leaving money on the table. I will mention it to Brendan." Derek nodded, satisfied, and went back to his phone. He had no idea who Brendan was. He had no idea that Brendan and I had been meeting quarterly for 6 years to review a financial picture that was, by any reasonable measure, not a small practice leaving money on the table. He had no idea because he had never once asked me a specific question about my work. Not the cases, not the clients, not the outcomes. The conversations we had about my career were always structured around his advice to me, never around information from me. I didn't correct him. I started rinsing the lettuce and asked my mother how she was sleeping. That night, I called Diane and updated her on 3 new observations I had added to my notes since our last conversation. She told me the pattern was consistent and the documentation was solid. Then she told me something that I had been circling but hadn't yet said directly. "At some point," she said, "you are going to need a precipitating event, something that moves this from a pattern into an incident. I want you to be ready when that happens, not scrambling." "I know," I said. "I am going to draft a preliminary petition, just the framework, nothing filed, but I want it ready." The second close call came 2 weeks later, and it was significantly more uncomfortable. I had stopped by Derek and Claudia's on a Tuesday evening to drop off a book Lily had left in my car. Claudia met me at the door, and I could tell immediately that something was off. She had the look she gets when Derek has said something that she's still deciding what to do with. Her hand went to the small gold chain at her collarbone. She did that when she was processing something she hadn't yet categorized as either acceptable or alarming. She let me in, and we stood in the kitchen for a few minutes while she poured water for both of us. Then she said, carefully, "Derek mentioned that you have been talking to Diane Castillo." I kept my face completely neutral. "Diane is a colleague, we talk regularly." Claudia turned the glass in her hands. "He ran into her assistant at the courthouse and apparently she mentioned," she stopped. "He is worried you are planning something." "Claudia." I waited until she looked at me. "I am a family law attorney. I have colleagues in family law. That is the entire beginning and end of what you are describing." She held my gaze for a long moment. Her hand went back to the chain. "Okay," she said finally. And I believed her, not because she was fully reassured, but because Claudia's survival strategy required her to accept the explanations that made her life easier. Accepting my explanation was easier than the alternative. What I did not tell her was that Diane's preliminary petition had been drafted 3 days earlier. That it was sitting in a folder on Diane's server, complete except for the precipitating incident. That I had reviewed it the previous afternoon and found it thorough and precisely calibrated to the evidence I had assembled. I picked up the book I had come to return, put it on the counter, and said I needed to get home. Claudia walked me to the door. At the threshold, she said, "He does love her, Nora, in his way." I looked at her for a moment. "I know you believe that," I said, and I meant it. I meant it without cruelty, because Claudia was not a bad person. She was a person who had spent her whole marriage choosing the explanation that required the least from her. And that choice had put her daughter in a room adjacent to a man who would say what he was about to say at that dinner, and had put Lily in the position of knowing, already at 9 years old, that the safest thing to do was pick up a tablet and press record. I drove home that night with the windows down. I thought about Lily on the couch with her cartoon, the tablet recording between the picture frames, the absolute stillness of a child who has already made peace with the fact that she is on her own in certain rooms. I called Brendan from my car. He answered on the second ring. "The education account," I said. "I want to understand the full picture. If we needed to move quickly, legally, formally, what is the current standing?" He walked me through the numbers. The 529 balance had grown to $74,000. The contributions had been consistent and documented. My name as custodian was clean and uncontested. No one else has any claim to it? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, Brendan said. It is entirely in your name as custodian for the benefit of the child. Your brother has no legal connection to this account whatsoever. Good, I said. Let's keep it that way. I pulled into my parking garage and sat in the car for a moment after the engine went off. Diane had told me to be ready when the precipitating incident arrived. I had been building toward ready for 3 years. The account, the documentation, the preliminary petition, the pattern of observations, all of it sitting in a folder, quiet and complete, waiting. I didn't know it would only be 4 weeks until Derek would open his mouth at a dinner table and hand me everything I needed. I didn't know Lily would already be 3 steps ahead of both of us. But I want you to understand that by the time that dinner happened, I was not scrambling. I was not reacting. I was already exactly where I needed to be. The only question left was whether the moment, when it came, would be enough. It was more than enough. The dinner happened on a Saturday in the middle of October. My mother had decided, with the particular enthusiasm she reserves for events that require everyone to put on a performance, that we would celebrate Derek's 42nd birthday as a family. Not a party, a dinner. The distinction, in my mother's vocabulary, meant the good china and the expectation that no one would talk about anything real. I arrived at 6:15 in the evening with a bottle of wine and Lily in the backseat, who had spent the drive telling me about a book her class was reading and asking me what I thought the main character should have done differently. She was wearing a green dress she had picked out herself. Her hair was in 2 braids that she had done independently and were slightly uneven in a way that she had informed me, when I pointed it out gently, was intentional. Asymmetrical, she said, adjusting one braid in the car window's reflection. That's a good word. Ms. Fujimoto taught it to me. It means on purpose but not the same. I thought about Hana Fujimoto and the quiet arrangement we had maintained for 3 years and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite comfort but was adjacent to it. Derek's car was already in the driveway. So was Claudia's mother's sedan, a small detail I noted because it meant there would be an extra layer of performance at the table. Claudia's mother, Renata Ferreira, was a woman of approximately 70 years who had the gift of making every observation sound like a compliment until you were home later and realized it hadn't been. She adored Derek in the way that certain mothers adore their daughters' husbands, completely, selectively, and in direct proportion to how much the husband validated her daughter's choices. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She was wearing the blue dress she saves for occasions she has decided matter, which told me she had been building toward this dinner in her head for at least a week. "You look nice," she said, which in my mother's language meant she had noticed and approved and wanted credit for noticing. She bent toward Lily. "And don't you look beautiful?" Lily accepted the compliment with the dignified composure of a 9-year-old who has been complimented by adults enough to know it doesn't require much response. "Thank you, Grandma Elaine." Inside, Derek was in the living room with a beer and the particular posture of a man who is comfortable in a space and wants everyone to know it. He had his arms stretched across the back of the sofa and his feet on the coffee table, a habit my mother had pretended to tolerate for 20 years because correcting Derek had always seemed to her like a project she didn't have the energy to start. "Nora." He lifted his beer in a kind of salute that was not unfriendly but was not warm either. "You're late." 6:17, I said. "You said 6:30. He looked at his watch, looked back at me. Lily went directly to find Claudia, which she always did. Claudia's relationship with Lily was, I had always believed, the most genuine thing about Claudia's marriage. Whatever else she had accommodated, whatever else she had looked past, Claudia's love for her daughter was real and uncomplicated, and probably the reason Lily was as intact as she was. Renata was in the kitchen helping my mother with the roast. She kissed me on both cheeks and told me my hair looked different, which I knew from experience was not a compliment. I smiled and poured myself a glass of water. Dinner was the kind of meal where the food was good and the conversation stayed in safe channels for a long time. My mother had made Derek's favorite roast lamb with the rosemary from her garden, and we talked about the landscaping company, about Renata's neighbor's renovation, about a television show my mother had been watching that she described in such detailed plot summary that even Derek, who had also seen it, seemed uncertain whether she was talking about the same show. Lily ate her dinner and participated when addressed and otherwise listened in the focused, careful way she had. She was seated next to me, which was our standard arrangement whenever we were at the same table, established without discussion over enough Sunday dinners that it had simply become true. It was over dessert, my mother's olive oil cake, which she makes twice a year and considers a gift to the room, that Derek started talking about money. He did this at most family dinners. The topic arrived the way weather arrives, not announced, just present. This time it began with the landscaping company's quarter. 2 large contracts had come in from a new residential development east of the city, and Derek was in the specific mood of a man whose business is doing well and who wants the room to know it without appearing to need the room to know it. "Good stretch," he said, forking through his cake. "Best October in 4 years. The development on the east side alone is worth close to $200,000 in contracts." My mother made the sound she makes when she's impressed, a kind of soft intake of breath. Renata nodded with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who feels her son-in-law's success reflects well on her. "That's wonderful," Claudia said. She was watching Derek with an expression I had learned to read over the years, a kind of cautious optimism, the way you watch a good streak at a card table, hoping it holds. Derek leaned back. "The key is volume. You keep your overhead down, you bid smart, you do not overextend. People overextend." He said this last sentence in the direction of no one in particular, which meant it was directed at everyone. That is where most small business owners fail. They grow too fast and they can't sustain it. I took a bite of cake. Across the table, my mother refilled Renata's water glass. "Nora, how are things for you?" Renata asked. "Still busy?" "Very," I said. "Family law must be interesting." She said it in the tone people use for jobs they have decided are not impressive but are trying to be polite about anyway. "All those divorces." "Among other things." Derek glanced at me. "You should think about corporate work. Better margins." He said this approximately once a year. Every year I said something neutral and let it pass. This year I said, "Probably," and ate more cake, and thought about the preliminary petition sitting in Diane Castillo's server and the education account with $74,000 in it, and the notes I had typed and dated covering every incident for the past 4 years. Then Lily asked to be excused from the table to use the bathroom. Claudia told her of course. Lily folded her napkin beside her plate, a habit I had taught her when she was 6 because I believed small ceremonies of care mattered, and she left the room. The conversation shifted briefly. Renata asked about a cousin's wedding that was apparently being planned for the following spring. My mother had opinions about the venue. Derek checked his phone. Then he looked at Claudia with an expression I can only describe as unguarded, the way people look when they believe the only people listening are the people they've accounted for, and he leaned slightly forward. "I was talking to Carlo this week about that development deal he's got going." Claudia looked up from her cake. "The commercial property? The whole portfolio. He's looking at a significant return." Derek's voice had the quality of a man running a calculation out loud. "Makes me think about liquidity. If we restructured a few things in the next year or two, freed up some capital." He paused, got rid of some of the overhead. Claudia's hand moved to her collarbone. Her fingers found the gold chain. "What overhead?" she said carefully. Derek shrugged, one shoulder, the shrug of a man who considers the calculation already made. "The school, the tuition, $9,000 a semester, Claudia. Carlo's kid goes to public school and he is doing fine." Claudia said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "She loves that school." "I know she loves it. I also know what $9,000 is." My mother was looking at her plate with an expression I recognized as deliberate non-involvement, the face she has worn for 30 years whenever Derek said something she knew was wrong but had decided was not her problem to address. Renata said, "The right school is so important for children." Derek looked at her. "With all respect, Renata, the right school is whatever the parents decide is right." A pause settled over the table, the kind of pause that precedes something. Then Derek picked up his fork, looked at Claudia, and said it. Casually, the way you say something you have been thinking for a while and have decided no longer needs to be dressed up. "I'd sell that kid for $50,000 if I could. Then Carlo and I could actually move." He laughed. A short, private laugh, like it was a joke between people who shared a certain understanding of how the world worked. Claudia looked down at her fork. My mother made a very small noise and picked up her water glass. Renata blinked 3 times in fast succession and then became very interested in her napkin. I did not move for 2 seconds. maybe 3. I was aware of the specific quality of the silence in the room, not the shocked silence of people who had never heard Derek talk this way, but the practiced silence of people who had learned to absorb and not respond. I was aware of my own hands on the table, completely still. I was aware that Lily was in the next room, and then I heard it. The faint click of a tablet camera icon, not the sound of a notification, the sound of an app opening. Barely audible, but I knew it because I know every sound that tablet makes. I gave it to her. I know what it sounds like when it opens. The conversation moved on. Derek said something else about Carlo's development deal. Renata recovered and asked my mother about the rosemary in the garden. My mother answered, and the table reassembled itself into the version of normal it always returns to, the one that requires everyone to quietly agree that certain things were not heard. I excused myself a few minutes later to use the kitchen. Lily was in the hallway. She was walking back toward the dining room, both hands at her sides, expression completely composed. She met my eyes for exactly 1 second. "Did you hear that?" I asked very quietly. She nodded once, the smallest movement. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." She said it the way a 9-year-old says yeah when they mean something more complicated but don't have the vocabulary for it yet. Then she said, "I recorded it." I looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," I said. "I'm going to make a phone call. You go back in and eat your cake." She went. I stood in the kitchen doorway for exactly 4 seconds, then I took my phone out of my bag and I called Diane Castillo. She answered on the 3rd ring. I could hear the sound of her television in the background and then the sound of it going mute. "Nora, we are moving up the timeline," I said. My voice was completely level. "File everything, all of it. I want to be ready to petition by Monday." A pause. Not surprise, Diane does not do surprise, but the pause of a professional shifting from off hours to on. "What happened?" He said it at the dinner table, in front of my mother and Claudia's mother and me. Lily was in the next room. I paused. She recorded it. Diane was quiet for 2 full seconds. Then, "On what device?" "Her tablet." I gave it to her. "It is functional, the microphone is clear, and she placed it deliberately." "How old is she?" 9. Another pause. I could hear Diane picking up a pen. "Can you get me the recording tonight? I will have it to you before midnight." "Okay." The television stayed off. "Nora, I want you to hear me. This is everything we needed. Do not do anything else tonight. Do not confront him. Do not tell Claudia. Go back to that table, finish dessert, and take Lily home." "I know. I will have the petition ready to file Monday morning. If the recording is as clear as you're describing, we will move for an emergency hearing." I put my phone in my bag. I stood in the kitchen for one more moment. Through the doorway, I could hear Derek saying something about interest rates and Renata agreeing and my mother asking if anyone wanted more cake. I walked back to the table. I ate my cake. I listened to my mother talk about the rosemary. I watched Derek lean back in his chair with the comfort of a man who has no idea what is already in motion. And I thought about Lily with her slightly asymmetrical braids, folding her napkin, picking up a tablet, pressing record. That night, in her bedroom before I drove her home, Lily showed me the recording without me asking. She held the tablet out with both hands like she was handing me something fragile. The audio was clear. Derek's voice. Claudia's silence. The precise, unhurried delivery of a man who believes he is only being overheard by people who will not act on what they hear. I transferred the file to my encrypted drive, sent a copy to Diane's secure client portal, and drove Lily home. She fell asleep in the backseat before we reached the highway. I drove with both hands on the wheel and did not listen to music. Everything was already moving. There was no taking it back. There was nothing left to take back. The family court hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning. I want to tell you what that week felt like. Diane filed the petition Monday morning as promised, and by Monday afternoon, we had an emergency hearing date. The petition was for third party, standing in the matter of Lily's welfare and custody arrangement, citing a documented pattern of statements made by Derek Ackafer that demonstrated a materially damaging view of his own child's value and well-being. It cited 5 specific incidents, each dated, each with corroborating detail. The recording was listed as Exhibit A. Derek was served on Tuesday. I know this because Claudia called me Tuesday evening, and the first thing she said before hello was, "How could you do this?" I let her finish. She went on for approximately 4 minutes about betrayal, about family, about the fact that she had always defended me to Derek, about how this was going to destroy everything. Her voice was steady but thin at the edges, the way a voice sounds when it is working very hard to stay composed. When she stopped, I said, Claudia, I need you to think about what he said. At that table, with your daughter in the next room, silence. I need you to think about whether that is the first time he has said something like that. More silence. The particular silence of a person who has spent years choosing not to know something and is now being asked to know it. She recorded it, I said. On her own. She was 9 years old and she knew enough to press record. I need you to think about what that means. Claudia did not respond for a long time. Then, very quietly, what is going to happen at the hearing? I'm going to ask the court to hear me. I'm going to present the evidence. The judge is going to decide what is in Lily's best interest. I paused. I think you know what the recording says. I think you've known for a long time what he says when he thinks no one important is listening. She hung up. I didn't call back. Wednesday, I sat with Diane in her office for 2 hours going over the structure of the hearing. She walked me through every likely counterargument. Derek's attorney, a man named Russell Howe who had a reputation for aggressive procedural tactics, would likely argue that the comment was hyperbole, that I had a personal grievance against Derek, and that third-party standing was an extraordinary remedy not warranted by the facts. Diane had prepared responses to each of these, specific and documented and calm. The recording speaks for itself, Diane said at the end of the meeting. But the pattern is what makes it actionable. 5 incidents over 4 years, documented, dated, witnessed. The recording is the exclamation point on a sentence that was already written. He's going to say it was a joke. He can say whatever he wants. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. The judge is going to listen to the audio and then look at a 9-year-old who pressed record instead of crying. That is not a child who has never heard things like that before. That is a child who has already learned what to do when she hears things like that. I drove home and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that evening. I thought about Lily's face in the hallway, the 1-second look. The composure she had built for herself, brick by patient brick, in a house where certain things were said and everyone agreed not to hear them. I thought about the fact that I hadn't taught her to record. I had given her the tablet. She had understood the rest on her own. Thursday morning arrived with the particular clarity of October, cold light, dry air, the kind of morning that feels like things are being decided. I wore the gray suit I wear to hearings when I want to project stillness rather than force. I arrived at the courthouse at 9:30. Diane was already there, at a small table outside the courtroom, reviewing her notes. She looked up when I came in. "How are you?" "Ready," I said. She studied me for a moment. "You know what his attorney is going to do in there." "I know. He's going to go at you personally. Your relationship with Derek, your motives, the fact that you are a family law attorney making this claim about your own brother. Let him." She nodded once and went back to her notes. That was one of the things I appreciated most about Diane. She did not feel the need to fill silence with reassurance. She had done the preparation. She trusted the preparation. So did I. Derek arrived at 9:50, with Russell Howe and Claudia. Derek was wearing a blue suit that I recognized as the one he wore to his company's annual contractor dinner. He looked confident in the performative way that people look confident when they are genuinely uncertain, but have decided the performance is their best option. He saw me across the lobby, and something moved across his face, not guilt, not yet, but a kind of recalibration, like a man adjusting the story he's been telling himself. Claudia did not look at me. Her hand went to the chain at her collarbone and stayed there. We were called into the hearing room at 10:10. The judge was the Honorable Margaret Solis. I had appeared before her twice in professional capacity. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with reading glasses she removed and replaced with a precision that communicated she had no time for things she had already decided were irrelevant. She reviewed the filed petition for approximately 90 seconds before she looked up. "Ms. Scott," she said, "you are both the petitioner and a licensed family law attorney. I'm going to note that for the record. You understand the standard for third-party standing you need to meet here." "I do, Your Honor." "And you believe you can meet it?" "I do." Judge Solis looked at Russell Howe. "Mr. Howe." Russell Howe was a tall man with a voice he had clearly worked to make sound measured and reasonable. "Your Honor, we would submit at the outset that this petition represents a personal grievance by Ms. Scott against her brother rather than a legitimate welfare concern. The standard for third-party standing is a high one precisely to prevent exactly this kind of overreach." Judge Solis turned a page in the petition. "I've reviewed the documented incidents cited. I note there are 5 of them, spanning 4 years, each with dates and specifics. I've also reviewed the description of the audio recording identified as Exhibit A. She looked at both tables. We're going to hear the recording. Then we're going to discuss what it means. Mr. Howe, your objection is noted and overruled for the purposes of proceeding. Derek, seated beside his attorney, straightened in his chair. His expression had shifted slightly, a tightening around the jaw that he probably thought was invisible. Diane placed the small Bluetooth speaker on the table. She connected it to her laptop. She looked at Judge Solis, who nodded. I looked at my brother across that room. He was watching the speaker the way you watch something you are trying to decide whether to be afraid of. Listen, I said, quietly enough that only the table heard it, to what he really thinks of her. Diane pressed play. The room heard the ambient sound of my mother's dining room, the light clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation at the edge of audio range. And then Derek's voice, completely clear, completely unhurried, in the exact register of a man who believes himself among safe company. I'd sell that kid for $50,000 if I could. Then Carlo and I could actually move. And then the laugh, short, private, like a math problem he had worked out and was satisfied with. The recording continued for another 11 seconds, ambient sound, Claudia's silence, the faint scrape of my mother's water glass, and then Diane stopped it. Judge Solis did not write anything for a moment. She took her reading glasses off and set them on the table in front of her and looked at Derek Aucaffer. Derek looked at Russell Howe. His attorney opened his mouth. Your Honor, Russell Howe began, voice carefully modulated. Context is critical here. Mr. Aucaffer was speaking in a moment of financial frustration. He was not literally expressing, Mr. Howe? Judge Solis's voice did not rise. I understand what your position is. You may complete it in your response. Right now I'm going to ask Mr. Aucaffer directly. She turned to Derek. Mr. Aucaffer, is that your voice on that recording? Derek had gone very still, not the stillness of composure. The stillness of a man whose body has realized before his mind has that the situation has changed completely. His hand was flat on the table in front of him. His fingers pressed down slightly, like he was trying to feel the surface. It is, he said. And that statement was made in your mother's home, at a family dinner, while your daughter was in the adjacent room? A pause, 2 full seconds. Yes. Judge Solis picked her glasses back up. Ms. Scott, continue. Diane was already sliding the first document across the table to me, the documented incident log, 5 years of dates and specifics and internal notations. I stood. Not because I had to, this was not a formal court proceeding requiring standing, but because I needed to feel my feet under me. Your Honor, the recording is not an isolated incident. I want to walk through the pattern that preceded it. Russell Howe interjected. Your Honor, we object to Ms. Scott presenting her own personal logs as objective evidence. She is the petitioner. She is Derek Aucaffer's sister. She has every conceivable personal motivation to, Mr. Howe. Judge Solis said it with the patience of someone who has already decided. Personal logs are admissible as supporting documentation in third-party standing petitions. The weight I give them is mine to determine. Ms. Scott, continue. I walked through the 5 incidents, each one specific. Each one dated. I did not editorialize. I did not characterize Derek's intentions or his psychology or what I believed he felt. I stated facts, what was said, where, who was present, what the context was, and what my professional assessment of that context was as a practicing family law attorney. That last part mattered. I was not just a sister with a grievance. I was a licensed professional with a documented basis for concern and the professional vocabulary to articulate it precisely. As I spoke, I watched Derek. The first incident, the birthday party comment about calculating Lily's college cost, he absorbed with the careful expression of a man holding a position. His jaw was set. His posture was controlled. By the second incident, the dinner where he referenced Lily's school in terms of appearance rather than education, something changed. Not dramatically. A slight shift in the set of his shoulders. He unclenched his hand from the table and put it in his lap. Your Honor, Russell Howe cut in again after the third incident, this is essentially hearsay combined with subjective interpretation by an interested party who, it's documented hearsay, Diane said crisply, not raising her voice. Dated, contemporaneous, consistent in pattern, and corroborated by the recording we have already heard. The standard for third-party standing does not require conviction-level evidence. It requires demonstrated concern for a child's welfare. I'd suggest we are considerably past that threshold. Russell Howe looked at his client. Derek was looking at the table. Claudia, seated on Derek's other side, had her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at nothing. Not at me, not at Derek, not at the judge. The chain at her collarbone was there and her hand was not touching it, which was, I realized, its own kind of statement. She had stopped reaching for it. She had arrived, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, at a place where reaching for it no longer made sense. Judge Solis looked at the documentation. She was thorough. She went through each dated entry without hurrying. The only sound in the room during that review was the faint scratch of her pen making notations in the margin. Then she looked up. Mr. Howe, I'm going to give you the opportunity to make your argument fully. I want to hear what Mr. Ackhaffer's position is on each of these documented incidents, beginning with the recording. Russell Howe conferred with Derek for approximately 45 seconds. During that time, Derek said something in a low voice, and his attorney listened and made a small, controlled gesture that I recognized as a lawyer managing a client who has just realized the position is weaker than they believed. Russell Howe straightened. Your Honor, Mr. Ackhaffer acknowledges that the statement on the recording was inappropriate and regrettable. He maintains that it was made in a moment of financial frustration, not as a literal expression of his feelings toward his daughter, and that it does not constitute the kind of chronic concerning pattern that third-party standing requires. A pause. He loves his daughter. The room held that last sentence for a moment. Judge Solis looked at it from several angles, the way you look at something that has been placed in front of you and needs to be properly assessed before you respond. Mr. Ackhaffer, she said. Derek looked up. You have a 9-year-old daughter who, in response to hearing her father make that statement, did not cry, did not ask for an explanation, and did not tell an adult immediately. Instead, she placed a recording device where it could capture audio and return to her activity. Judge Solis's voice was even, not unkind, but entirely without softness. Do you understand what that tells me about what your daughter already knows about how to survive in your house? Derek opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his lawyer. Russell Howe began, Your Honor, that was a question for Mr. Ackhaffer. She did not look at Howe. Mr. Ackhaffer. The silence that followed was not the kind of silence that gets filled. Derek had the expression of a man who has rehearsed several responses and found that none of them fit the actual question being asked. His face did something I had not seen it do before, a kind of interior collapse, not dramatic, just the quiet falling away of the performance he had been maintaining since he walked through the door. He looked, for approximately 3 seconds, like the version of himself that existed before he decided being the loudest person in the room was the same as being the most important one. No, he said, and the single word came out different from everything else he had said in that room. Quieter. Without the practiced steadiness, I didn't know she knew how to do that. He meant it as a defense. In the room, it landed as the opposite. Claudia made a very small sound, not a cry, more like something releasing that had been held under pressure for a long time, her hands unfolded in her lap. She did not look at Derek. She looked at the middle distance, the particular gaze of a woman who has just arrived at a conclusion she has been approaching for years. Judge Solis made a note. Several notes. The scratch of her pen was the only sound. Then she removed her glasses entirely, set them to the side, and addressed both tables. I'm going to make a finding today. Based on the documentation presented by Ms. Scott, the audio recording, and Mr. Ackhaffer's own confirmation of the recorded statement, I find sufficient grounds to grant third party standing to Ms. Nora Scott in matters concerning the welfare and educational support of the child. She paused. I am also issuing an interim order suspending Mr. Ackhaffer's unsupervised custody pending a full welfare evaluation. During that evaluation period, primary residential care of the child will be with the mother. Mr. Ackhaffer will have supervised visitation only to be arranged through a court-approved supervisory service. Russell Howe was already preparing to speak. Judge Solis looked at him. Mr. Howe, if you have grounds for an emergency appeal of this interim order, you know where to file. In the meantime, the order stands. She looked at both tables one final time. The welfare evaluation will be conducted by Dr. Alicia Torres, whose office will contact both parties within the week. I expect full cooperation. We are adjourned. The gavel came down. The sound of it in that room was small and final and entirely sufficient. Derek sat still for a moment after the judge left. Then he turned to his attorney, and the two of them began a low, tight conversation that I did not need to hear. Diane packed her documents with the same methodical efficiency she brings to everything. She clicked her laptop shut. She unplugged the speaker and wrapped its cable and put it in her bag. I stood at the table for a moment and looked at my brother's profile. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the far wall, the conversation with his attorney apparently finished, his face doing something I couldn't fully read, not remorse exactly, but something close to the neighborhood of it. The look of a man who said the quiet part out loud and got the result that was waiting for him. Claudia was at the door. She paused there, hand on the frame. She looked back at me. Her eyes were very bright, not with anger, with the complicated wetness of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just set it down. "She's at school right now," Claudia said. "I know. She doesn't know about today?" "No," Claudia nodded. Then she said, quietly, "Thank you." It came out barely above a whisper. Her hand dropped from the door frame and she walked out. I stood in that room for one more moment after everyone else had gone. My hands had been steady the entire hearing. They were still steady. I noticed that I had been breathing in a controlled way for approximately 3 hours and that I could now stop doing that deliberately and let it be natural. I let it out slowly. The room was just a room again. Fluorescent lights, a laminate table, 4 chairs, and a window that looked out onto an October sky that was very blue and very clear and not, as far as I could tell, particularly interested in what had just happened in here. It didn't need to be. Things had been decided. That was enough. The weeks after the hearing moved with the particular momentum of legal processes once they are fully in motion. The welfare evaluation with Dr. Alicia Torres took place over 3 sessions. I was interviewed in the first session, Derek and Claudia separately in the second, and Lily, alone with Dr. Torres, in the third. Dr. Torres was a soft-spoken, rigorous woman who asked questions in the way that made clear she was not interested in the performance of an answer, only its content. When her report was filed with the court 6 weeks later, it was 42 pages. I reviewed it in full. The findings were consistent with everything I had documented. The report used clinical language, careful and precise, but the picture it assembled was the same one I had been looking at for 4 years. A child who had developed sophisticated self-protective behaviors at an early age. A child who was functioning well, academically excellent, socially engaged, emotionally articulate, but who had built those capacities in a context that required her to manage, rather than simply be held by, the adults around her. Dr. Torres noted specifically that Lily's decision to record the audio without prompting from any adult was consistent with a child who had already developed a reliable understanding that certain adults in her environment could not be trusted to manage difficult information on her behalf. Reading that sentence, I had to set the report down and look out the window for a moment. The final custody order was issued in late November. Derek's unsupervised custody was revoked pending completion of a 12-month parent education and behavioral assessment program. Supervised visitation was reduced from the interim arrangement and formalized with specific conditions. My third-party standing was confirmed, granting me the legal right to be present at school conferences, to receive copies of Lily's medical and educational records, and to file petitions on her behalf in any future proceeding where her welfare was at issue. Derek did not fight the final order. Russell Howe filed one motion to modify and withdrew it 4 days later. I do not know what conversation happened between attorney and client to produce that withdrawal, and I did not ask. What I know is that Derek completed 2 months of the parent education program before he stopped attending. The court was notified. His supervised visitation schedule was further restricted as a result, reduced to twice monthly, supervised in a neutral facility. As of the last report I received, he had not yet resumed consistent attendance. Claudia filed for separation in December. She told my mother first, which I learned 3 days later when my mother called me and said, in a careful voice that was trying very hard not to take a position, "Did you know she was thinking about this?" I said that I had not known specifically, but that I was not surprised. My mother was quiet for a moment and then said, "She's going to need support." I said, "Yes, she is, so is Lily." My mother said she understood. And then she said something I had not expected, said it simply and without ornamentation. "You did the right thing, Nora." I told her thank you. We talked for a while longer about nothing in particular, and it was one of the more honest conversations we had had in years. Claudia and Lily moved into a 2-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes from my office. Claudia took a full-time position with a property management company where she had done part-time bookkeeping for years. Lily transferred, at no disruption, to her school where her enrollment remained secure, the supplemental account I had run quietly through my practice continuing without any change, except that I now told Claudia it existed. Claudia cried when I told her. A real cry, not polite. The kind that comes when you realize someone has been standing behind you, hand out, for a long time without asking anything in return. Lily is doing well. She is doing, by any measure I can apply, completely and specifically well. She joined a coding club at her school in the spring and has been writing a program that she describes as a quiz game, which she has been testing on me with increasing complexity each time I see her for our standing Sunday arrangement. She has advanced her braiding technique considerably. Last month she informed me, with the gravity of someone sharing a considered professional opinion, that asymmetrical is still interesting, but she has been exploring symmetrical as a counterpoint. I told her I looked forward to seeing where the research led. Derek and I have not spoken. I do not know that we will, in any meaningful way, for a long time. I don't carry particular anger about that. I carry the clarity of a decision I made in a kitchen doorway on a Saturday night in October, phone in hand, voice completely steady, while my mother's dining room returned to normal behind me and a 9-year-old girl held a tablet between two picture frames and waited for the world to be different than it was. It is different. That is, as far as I am concerned, the entire point. So, did I go too far or not far enough? Tell me what you think in the comments.